In the depth of darkness, where shadows dance and whispers, there is fear that lurks in every corner. The cold air broke through the hot summer night as Jean and his cousin had finally made it out of the woods. Ahead of them lay a very narrow dirt path. Along the side of this path was grass that was as tall as the men themselves. And underneath the moonlight, the wind blew the grass and they waved, beckoning them into the darkness. The two guys walked down this narrow path with Jean leading them. And suddenly Jean stops. Ahead of him, he sees this image of this woman just standing there. Underneath the moonlight, he could see she had long black hair and a pale face. Her face almost glowed underneath the moonlight tonight. Jean stops and tells his cousin to shh and points to the grass, and the two of them get off the dirt path and hide in the grass and watch. This woman, she walked up the path and suddenly stopped. As if she heard them, she tilts her head towards their direction and then quickly and swiftly walked backwards to where she started. Underneath this big tree she stood, just kind of waiting for someone. The two guys, they listened closely as they heard a voice coming from behind the tree, and suddenly this tall man comes out. He takes her hand and they walk away happily. Jean feels an elbow in his rib as his cousin tells him it was just two lovers trying to have some fun at night. Both of them walked out of the grass and made their way home. But Jean couldn't get that image of that woman out of his head. It was like he fell in love with a ghost. He had hope that he would meet her again, but little did he know that that was only going to be the start of his nightmare. Several weeks later, as he went back to the village to see his friend, he met a beautiful lady by the name of May. May had a shocking resemblance to the lady he saw that night underneath the full moon. And so with that, he suddenly fell in love with her, as if she cast a spell on him. But his love was only one-sided, as May did not feel the same. During that time, women were taught to be kind to all suitors, even if they didn't like that person. And so May was being kind to him, and he took it the wrong way. And so he came to see her more and more. May, at this point, became annoyed by his presence and brought her boyfriend to visit. And when they met each other, the boyfriend and May gave him the cold shoulder. And that was when he realized where he stood in her world. But he couldn't let her go, because he liked her so much. And it was his one-sided love that blinded him to both evil and good. One day, May's boyfriend told her that he was going into town, but instead, he went hunting with his brother and cousins. And they had been gone for several days at this point, and the hunting team was getting tired. They came across this beautiful, deep, dense foliage area with lots of deer tracks. The oldest brother told them that they should all split up. That way they'll be able to track the deer faster, and so they did. At this point, they had been gone for several days, and the hunting crew was starting to get exhausted. May's boyfriend was making his way up the south side of the hill, where there was a lot of bushes and trees. In that moment, the sound of the leaves and twigs being broken underneath his footstep caught the attention of his cousin. His cousin turned around to see this big deer with huge antlers staring at him. But it wasn't until he heard the sound of the boyfriend screaming that he realized he shot a person. And that cousin frantically tried to help him, but he couldn't. He shouted for help, but the other members were too far away to hear them. And so what he did was he took the rifle and fired warning shots into the air to get the attention of the rest of the people. By the time the rest of them came around, May's boyfriend was becoming very weak. When they reached home, it was about midnight, and her boyfriend was starting to lose consciousness. The brothers and cousins went door to door asking for help from the villagers. The closest hospitals were in the big city, which was a couple of days' walk away, and the boyfriend would have never made it. It was around 1 o'clock before May's parents heard pounding on their door. A man was on the other side asking if anybody was awake to please try and help them save their brother. Her parents got up and opened the door, and her father went with the young gentleman that was standing in the doorway. May thought it was someone else, and she didn't get up to check or help the situation. That whole night, the villagers desperately tried to save her boyfriend's life. In the morning, May decided to go check out what all that commotion was about and who was the one that got hurt. She followed the crowd to her boyfriend's house, and that's when her heart dropped. It couldn't be, she thought. She made her way through the crowd, and there, lying in bed, was her boyfriend. In shock, she didn't say anything but just stared at him. She couldn't talk, couldn't hold his hand, couldn't kiss him. And so he lay there limp and holding on to the last breath of life. May never liked the sight of blood or wounds, and so she left his bedside to go home. After she left, within a few minutes, her boyfriend passed away. The villagers cried and mourned his death, and the sound of crying filled the air and echoed through the valley where May's village was. Her mother heard the crying and quickly came to tell May the news. However, instead of sorrow or sadness, she became petrified at the thought of her dead boyfriend. Her legs buckled from underneath her, and she needed to sit down. Her mother asked if everything was all right, but she couldn't bear to tell her mother the truth. You see, one fateful night underneath the full moon, her and her boyfriend had made a blood promise using dark magic. And she couldn't tell her mother that, because with this blood oath, if one partner dies, the other one must die. One cannot live without the other. Thus, it was a dangerous oath among young lovers, with serious spiritual and paranormal consequences. So May slowly walked back to her room as if she was a zombie and just locked herself in there. During this era, funerals were held in the home of the deceased. There was no embalming procedures or autopsies available, and so the deceased was placed in a handmade wooden coffin. Then that coffin was placed in the front of the living room for everyone to view. And the funeral started shortly after death because the body would go through the post-mortem stage quickly. And the weather was warm, so that meant that the body was going to start getting bloated and discolored very fast. It made it super important to try and finish all the death rituals and the ceremony for the dead in a very timely manner. As the family began their funeral ceremony, the drums for the dead can be heard echoing through the village. It gave the village a creepy feel to know that someone they love has died. The sound of the drums echoed through May's house, so she buried her head in the pillows, just listening to every single sound. The drums from the funeral, the crying and mourning villagers. While she was underneath the covers trying to black out and for a moment there she felt as if someone gently touched the top of her head and said her name, May. Around 9 o'clock that night, her boyfriend's family came to talk to her family. Because they were a pretty tight-knit community, her parents decided that they would go over to his house and try to help with hosting some of the guests that came over so the family themselves can take a break. So May was petrified to even be in the same house as her lover. Her mother could see her fear, and she knew something was wrong, but she just didn't know the truth behind her daughter's fear. The next day, the boyfriend's family asked May to participate in the funeral speech, as she was someone that their son loved. And so she stood there in front of the room, and she gave a quick speech about how she loved him and what a great person he was. And she talked about their plans for the future and gave her condolences to the family. As she was doing that, she glanced over, and for a moment, it looked like her boyfriend's eyes were open. And they were staring at her, these cold, lifeless eyes staring at her. Startled, she jumped away from the coffin and screamed, and when people came to look, his eyes were closed and he lay there peacefully. Or so it seemed for that moment. May was scared to her core. She couldn't stop trembling. Her brother came over and said, May, why don't you go? As May was walking home, she couldn't shake this feeling like she was being followed by something ominous, something dark. The boyfriend's family were waiting for a relative to come and participate in the ceremony of their son's death, and the relative was delayed. You see, back in that decade, there was no cars or other transportation. A lot of it was done by walking on foot. And sometimes, if the weather didn't permit it, people didn't get to where they wanted to in time. And thus his trip was delayed. And so the family of the boyfriend decided to wait for the relative to show up first before they bury their loved one. However, by morning, the boyfriend's corpse had started to change color, and his face became unrecognizable due to the processes of death and dying. It created a very unpleasant and very eerie feeling for all the guests that was there. Some of them even reported that he had a smirk on his face. Other people reported that there were times where it looked like his eyes were slightly open, as if he was just pretending to be asleep or pretending to be dead. And May was frightened to even accompany the family to the burial site. She had become so frightened that she did not even accompany the one that loved her. She did not walk by his side as they laid him to his final resting place. She couldn't bear to look at him anymore. The day that they buried her boyfriend, it was raining a lot. It was as if the sky themselves were crying for his death and also for hers. And with a heavy heart, the villagers accompanied her boyfriend's family, along with May's parents, and they took him to his final resting place. As they put the last shovel of dirt over his grave, his mother swore that she heard him say, "Where's May?" The rain then suddenly got really heavy as if a monsoon was coming, and the family had to leave the burial site. As they made their way down the slippery slopes, his mother fell and slipped. And when she slipped, she heard a voice say, "Mom." As she laid on the ground looking up at the rain, she turned her head, and off to the distance, where the burial site was, she saw her son standing there. He was just standing there looking at her. Then her husband quickly came and helped her off the ground, and they all went home. Back at the village, May laid in her bed looking at the ceiling while listening to the rain's pitter-patter on the roof, when suddenly they somehow started to sound like footsteps, one after the other, as if somebody was walking on the roof. Now at this point, May was by herself, and there was no one else in the house. And then the wind that was howling through the window started to sound like whispers calling her name. And she thought that she heard her boyfriend's voice just for a second. 3 days later, things started to get very strange for May. It was after dark when she first noticed the scent of a rotten stench. It filled the area in her room where her bed was located. She stood up and walked to the doorway, and there the smell was faint. But when she returned to her bed, the stench became strong, and the rotten stench continued to fill her room, and her room got really, really cold. It smelled like rotten flesh or decomposing meat, the kind that you would smell if you walked past like a chicken who died on the farm, or like a wild animal that died on the side of the road. A small whiff of that smell was enough to make you feel sick to your stomach. So May shouted for her mother, Mom, please come into my room. Do you smell that?" Her mother came to her room. The smell of her room made her mother gag. Never had they encountered such a stench before. She went outside to see if there was any farm animals that had died nearby, but the search came up with nothing. They searched May's room again, but they couldn't find the source of the stench. And May was so scared to the point where she decided to sleep in the same room as her mother. And just as they were about to drift into sleep, May heard the sound of footsteps shuffling from the door towards her bed quickly. Then her mother started to dry heave and gag. And that was when May noticed that the smell was inside their room too. And the air felt dense and heavy, and as they tried to breathe, it felt like their lungs was filled with water. It was a very creepy feeling. The room became ice cold, and the smell just seeped into the skin, even if they held their breath. Well, May's mother and her couldn't go anywhere in the middle of the night, so all they had was one oil lamp. And where would they go? They were already too scared to walk down the dark road all the way to the next door neighbor's house. Who knows if the neighbors are even awake anymore? And so the two of them just huddled underneath the blanket and tried their best not to inhale the rotten stench. They must have dozed off because they were awakened by the sound of the neighbors getting ready for the day. Mom, wake up," she said. "Mom, wake up." And her mother woke up and realized it was daylight too. And the two of them went downstairs and got breakfast started. About 2 weeks later, Jean returned to May's village in hopes of seeing her again. Little did he know that her boyfriend was killed and buried recently. And since he was from the village far across the valley, he didn't know what happened. And so he just assumed that everything was the same. The sky was getting dark, and Jean finally arrived at May's house. He saw the faint light of the oil lamp through her window. He was afraid of getting scolded by her parents for coming so late, so he went around the side of the house towards the window where May's room was. And behind the trees, he hid as he threw little pebbles at her window, trying to get her attention. There was no response. Then he threw another pebble. "Come on, May," he thought. "Look over here." But Jean had no clue what May was going through at that time. The sound of that pebble hitting her window made her heart sink, and the thought of her dead boyfriend coming back raced through her mind. Then she heard a second pebble, and a third. She peeked out from underneath the blankets and looked outside, and from behind the tree she could see a man standing there. It was getting dark, so she couldn't tell who it was. When Jean noticed that she was looking out the window, he called for her. "Hey, May, it's Jean. Can you talk?" May breathed a sign of relief as it was Jean, and she had thought that her dead boyfriend was coming back to get her, to fulfill their blood promise. "Hello, Jean. I haven't seen you in a while. How's your family been? How are you?" And Jean became delighted at this. His heart raced, thinking May has finally given him a chance because she had never asked such questions before. He thought, "This is it. I think she's finally warming up to me." Jean put on a huge smile on his face, and he happily skipped over to her window. May opened the window just enough for Jean to look in, and the two of them talked into the night. When it was late, May was hinting that she was feeling sad recently, and so Jean thought that it must have been her way of trying to tell him that she missed him. And so he was so happy to hear her say that. But because it was late, the two of them whispered through the window. And May was telling Jean something when she heard a voice from behind him. It was the voice of her dead boyfriend. The voice was answering the question that May had just asked Jean. She became terrified, and all the goosebumps rose on her thighs and arms, and the hair stood on the back of her neck. Her heart raced as she recognized that voice. "It couldn't be," she whispered. Jean asked, "What couldn't be?" And then there was a moment of silence. The two of them looked at each other, and Jean finally broke the silence by answering the question that she had just asked. After a moment, May asked Jean, "Jean, did you come alone, or did you come with someone?" He looked around. "No, just me," he said. "Don't lie," she said. "Don't lie to me. It's not funny. It's not funny to play a prank with me at this time. Did you bring a friend with you, or was it just you out there?" Jean said, "It's just me, May. There's no one else around. I'm not playing a prank on you." May scolded him. She didn't believe him, and they bickered for a bit before this rotten stench started to seep into their noses from where they were both standing. May recognized the smell. She knew it was the same rotten stench that filled her room shortly after her boyfriend died. She started trembling. "Jean, you have to go. I need to sleep now. And there's just a lot to do tomorrow, so you should leave." "Sure." He looked confused. "Well, I guess get some rest." I'll be on my way now. You're right, it's getting late too. Jean watched as May closed the window and blew out the oil lamp. And Jean smiled to himself when he realized it was quite chilly out. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them up, and he turned to leave, and there, right in front of him, was a dark, shadowy figure. He stopped. The shadow figure gently floated side to side before vanishing into the air. And he didn't know how to explain what he just saw. So that night, instead of going home, he went to sleep at his friend's house, which was in the same village as May. And he waited till the next morning before he headed home. This wasn't enough to scare Jean. Nope. He kept coming back to meet May for several more weeks. And then he started to notice her boyfriend wasn't around anymore. Well, of course he wasn't going to ask her, right? If he's not around, that meant he had all the attention of May. And he was loving it. But curiosity did get the best of him. And one day he sat down with his friend from her village and asked him, why isn't her boyfriend coming around? His friend asked him, you really don't know what happened? His other friend said, man, you missed a lot in this couple weeks. Nobody in this town, nobody in this village wants to go and date her. Don't you hear about the rumors? She's being haunted or being hexed by her dead boyfriend. I would stay away if I were you. His friend said, a couple of days after you left last time, he went hunting and there was an accident. Oh my gosh, said Jean. So now Jean was sitting there with his friends, and he was starting to have mixed emotions. And then he thought back to the night when he saw the shadowy figure outside of May's window. After that, he tried to forget about May, but he was far too invested and he couldn't stop thinking about her. He just had to see her again. And again and again. And over time, his feelings got deeper and stronger towards her. And even though he got goosebumps at times from being with her, he just put on a brave face and just kept going back to see May. About 4 months after her boyfriend died, she started having nightmares. He was coming back for her. They were very vivid dreams. His bloating corpse crawled on the floor towards her. In other dreams, he would be hanging upside down in her room when she woke up. There were nights when she woke up to someone underneath the covers next to her, and when she pulled the blankets back, there was nothing there. And these horrifying dreams and experiences became very traumatizing for her at this point. And May became very sick. Her health plummeted, and her parents became very concerned. One afternoon, after a very horrifying dream, she woke up with sweat all over her body. She woke up with strange marks on her hands and feet, as if someone had colored them. She screamed, and her mother and father came into the room and saw the same marks on her body. And that was when May finally confessed. She said, Mom and Dad, I know why this is happening. I made a terrible mistake. A horrible mistake, and I'm going to die, Mom. She confided in her parents about the nightmares and the paranormal experiences since her boyfriend died. She told her parents that there was no escape. We don't understand, May. What do you mean? Her mom said. May finally told her parents, Mom, I took a blood oath with him before he died. She cried. I don't want to die, Mom. I don't know what to do. Her parents were so concerned for her, but her dad was so angry with her for making such a stupid mistake. What the hell were you thinking, child? Her father screamed. He was so mad he kicked the chair across the room. What do we do now? Said her mom, as tears fell down her face. Her father continued to scold and scream out of anger and frustration. Finally, the mom stopped him, and they left the room. Little did May know that her father felt helpless. As he sat there and cried, he didn't know how to save his little girl. So her parents came up with the idea of sending her away to live with her grandmother. They didn't tell May this. Her parents just gathered up her things, wrapped her in a blanket, and put her in the wagon. And she was too sick to argue with them, so she silently went along with the plan. And they covered her up with hay, and the neighbors took her away to her grandmother's house. Once she was at her grandmother's house, she actually started to recover, and she didn't have those nightmares and paranormal experiences anymore, at least for the time that she was there. Now, Jean didn't know about this, and he came back to see her, and she was gone. And her parents wouldn't tell him anything. "Get out of here, boy," they said. "If you know what's good for you, don't come back here." And Jean had never been treated so poorly by her parents. He was angry. He was upset. And he was complaining to his friend. And during that conversation, the friend's younger brother overheard them and said, "Jean, they put her in a wagon and took her away the other day." "What?" "Yeah, they put her in a wagon and took her away. I saw it in the morning when I was coming back home." Then Jean went to ask around the village. Eventually, someone did tell him that May was taken to her grandmother's house, and that her house was in the village on the other side of the mountain. So after a day's trip on foot, Jean reached the village, and when he finally got there, he found May. And May was so happy to see him, and they embraced each other like long-lost lovers. And Jean was angry at her parents for sending her away. And during their conversation, May asked Jean if he was interested in marriage. And Jean had thought he hit the jackpot, and he instantly proposed to May. Now, May never told Jean the reason why her parents sent her away. You see, back in the days in some cultures, if someone was being haunted or had a spiritual attachment, the family would secretly move that person away from the home in hopes that the bad spirits wouldn't be able to follow them or find them. So May's parents were doing this to protect May, and Jean didn't know. May knew about this, and then she had this thought: why if Jean married me? Why if I just marry this man? I don't have to love him. Why if I just marry him and he takes me away and all this ends? So when Jean proposed to May that day, she accepted the proposal, and the two of them eloped from the grandmother's house. He just took her back to his house and told his parents, "Mom, I'm gonna marry this lady." The parents didn't know who she was. But after asking around, they learned who May's family was. And then they settled on a wedding date. And Jean's family was excited to have a new daughter-in-law, but May's family had a different kind of excitement. They thought that maybe, just maybe, she may have escaped the consequences of her blood promise with the previous boyfriend. And it was a strange wedding because Jean was so blindsided the whole entire time. There was no paranormal experiences at the wedding, or even after the wedding. However, May's parents told Jean to never come back to see them, never ever bring their daughter back to see them ever again. Jean thought the family hated him for eloping with her while she was at her grandmother's house. But the real reason is something that Jean didn't even know about yet. And this concludes Part 1. My wife became a ghost. Please join me next week as we listen to Part 2 of My Wife Became a Ghost.